We're going to talk about muscle soreness. There's two types of muscle soreness. There's the acute muscle soreness that you feel when you're exercising or immediately after exercise. And then there's the delayed, what we call DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, which is the soreness you'll feel the next day and maybe several days after exercising. So the acute muscle soreness can basically be caused by two different things. Either the drop in pH, right? When the hydrogen ions accumulate, the pH drops. We get that acidic environment. And nociceptors, your pain receptors, will pick up on this and you will have the sensation of pain. Also, during exercise, you also do get some edema in the muscle cells because you get a lot of extra blood flow going to the muscle cells, and edema causes swelling, and if swelling is intense enough, that can also stimulate nociceptors and cause pain. Acute muscle soreness is gone within minutes. As we saw on the last recording, your pH can be elevated for several minutes, up to 30 minutes after, so you may have some pain lingering, but should be gone at least within an hour or two. So delayed onset, or DOMS, this is the muscle soreness that you get. It usually peaks 24 to 48 hours after a heavy exercise bout. You may have noticed if it's upper body, it tends to peak at about 24 hours, and your lower body tends to take a little longer to peak, and it may take up to 2 days before you feel the full extent of the pain. So some things that we know about DOMS, it's much more prevalent with eccentric contractions. They're the primary initiators of DOMS. We think it's because with an eccentric contraction, the muscle fibers are lengthening, and they're being forced to lengthen by the resistance of the weight. And we think that to some extent, those muscle fibers are literally, or the myosin heads are literally being ripped off of the actin and ripped apart, causing a lot of strain, a lot of physical damage, which is going to cause pain. We'll talk a little bit more about that on a different slide. The thing you have to be careful with is something called rhabdomyolysis. And this isn't in your textbook, but it's an interesting thing that you might want to check it out on the internet and read a little bit more about it. This is very excessive muscle damage and can actually be life-threatening. Some of the indicators are just very, very extreme pain, brown urine. Because what happens when the muscle damage is excessive, you end up with a lot of myoglobin and creatine kinase. Okay. In the blood. So normally myoglobin, which carries oxygen in the muscle cell, is only in the muscle cell. And creatine kinase, which is that enzyme that breaks down PCR, also is normally only located in the muscle. So when the muscle's damaged, physically damaged, and basically torn, these things seep into the blood. And your body can handle a little bit of this, but when a lot of this ends up in the blood, it actually puts a really high strain on the kidney and can cause kidney failure and even death. So brown urine, very excessive pain, need to get to the emergency room right away. This is another reason why it's really important to hydrate after your workouts, because that helps to wash away any of these things that might have ended up in your blood, okay? And so it dilutes it and makes it less stressful to the kidney. So that's rhabdomyolysis. So just be careful with yourself and with individuals. Sometimes this happens with kids because people have this impression that kids are kids and you can't hurt them. And there have been lots of instances where kids have had rhabdomyolysis because the PE teacher or coach made them do too much. So it's important to be aware of it. No pain, no gain. There is evidence that if without the pain, you're probably not going to get adaptation. And you're probably not going to get increases in strength or hypertrophy. DOMS is likely necessary in order to maximize the adaptation response. So remember, if you want a muscle to adapt, or you want anything to adapt, you need to overload it, and you need to stress the system. And when you stress the system, the body, the physiological changes occur, adaptations occur, which in the muscle would cause an increase in strength and an increase in hypertrophy. And so if you didn't overload the muscle enough and didn't have any pain, you may not have overloaded the muscle enough to cause adaptation. So that's where no pain, no gain comes from. Now, while you have DOMS, your performance is going to be affected. So if you're an athlete and you're getting ready for your game or event, you want to make sure that you don't have any DOMS. You want to make sure that whatever muscles have been damaged during training are completely recovered before your performance. Because during DOMS, you're going to have reduced ability to generate force because you've actually got physical damage to your fibers, to your actin and myosin. So the actin and myosin that have been damaged are not going to be able to form cross bridges, and that's going to limit your ability to generate force. Also, we find that during DOMS, muscle glycogen resynthesis is impaired. So for about the first 6 to 12 hours after exercise, it seems to be okay, but after about 6 to 12 hours, when the muscle is undergoing repair, muscle glycogen resynthesis is reduced. So it's harder to fill those glycogen stores and therefore be ready for an event. And this is why, for instance, marathon runners don't do very much running in the week prior to the event. They want to make sure all of these things are cleared out and they're 100% available for their event. So this is a really big oversimplification, but it really is fine for our purposes. And again, the precise mechanism of what causes DOMS is not very well understood, and we may find out that this is not how it happens, or that it might be slightly different than this. But basically, when you contract a muscle, you shorten the muscle, you develop high tension in the contractile elastic system of the muscle. You pull on the muscle fibers. And if this tension is high enough, as it is, particularly with eccentric contractions, this causes structural damage to the fibers and also to the surrounding connective tissue. And what we see, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, is muscle cell membranes are ruptured and sarcomeres are literally torn apart. And this is going to trigger an inflammatory response, which is going to result in edema, everything rushing to the area to fix and repair the damage that's been done. And inflammation products and edema stimulate nociceptors, and that's what causes our pain. So you can read a little more detail about this if you're curious in our textbook, but again, we're not going to go into any more detail than this. So this is interesting. This is a slide. This is an electron micrograph of a muscle sample from a muscle right immediately following a marathon. And you can see here, you can see the ruptured cell membranes, and you can see that the contents of the muscle cells are floating freely between the other cells, between the other fibers. These are all individual fibers here. And you can see these fibers have literally been ripped apart, and everything is seeping. This is another interesting picture. This is electron micrograph immediately before and immediately after a marathon. And remember back to chapter 1, remember about our cell membranes. So here we have sarcomere, right? Your Z line, your M line, here's a sarcomere. And you can see here in the post, you can see that the sarcomeres are disrupted. The Z lines in some cases are missing. You don't have these clean little sarcomeres. Everything is just a mess. And so, as you can imagine, these fibers, these actin and myosin, are not going to be available to form cross bridges until they're repaired. So this is why during DOMS you're going to lose some strength. Now these are really interesting. Let's go through these kind of carefully. What we see here is eccentric versus concentric exercise. So the eccentric is the red. And we have 6 different graphs. And what we have is pre. So this, for instance, this graph is maximal voluntary contraction. What percentage of that person's maximum ability are they able to do? So let's say they were doing bench press and their 1RM was 100 pounds. If they did 100, then that would be 100%. So pre-exercise, you can see they're at 100%. And when we look immediately after exercise, you can see that their strength is reduced. And then you look at 1 day, 2, 3, 4, 5 days post. But what's really interesting is look how much more of a reduction in MVC we have after eccentric versus concentric. Okay, a lot more damage, a lot more going on as a result of eccentric exercise. The second one here, we have range of motion. And you can see again that after eccentric exercise, there's a significant reduction in this individual's ability to move through the normal range of motion. This is going to be the joints that are attached to whatever muscles were trained. Here we have circumference. This represents swelling. Okay, and we can see again that with the eccentric exercise, we get a much greater circumference several days after exercise. And this is the swelling. This is the edema as a result of inflammation, everything rushing to that area to fix it. And we get a lot more swelling after eccentric exercise, again, because there's a lot more damage. Here, this one is really amazing. Here we have CK activity. This is creatine kinase. And you can see that and this is in the blood, the creatine kinase levels after eccentric exercise are very, very high. Same with myoglobin. So a lot more damage was done, therefore a lot more CK, a lot more myoglobin ended up in the blood. And you can see how long it takes for that to go back to normal. Even after 5 days, these values are still elevated. And then the last one just shows soreness. This was a person rating their soreness, and you can see how much more sore they were after eccentric exercise. So, interesting data. So, how do you minimize DOMS? Well, the first thing I would say is maybe you don't want to minimize DOMS, right? Because no pain, no gain. But that's not okay for everybody. For instance, if I took my mom to the gym, she's never been to the gym in her life, but if I did, and she came home and was sore the next day, she probably would never go back. So if you're a trainer and you're training an individual who may not enjoy the pain that we as kinesiology people tend to enjoy, you do need to know how to minimize it, because you don't want to hurt people, and you certainly don't want to cause rhabdomyolysis. So some of the things to keep in mind: if you to minimize DOMS, you need to minimize the damage, because the damage is what's causing DOMS. So start with a very low intensity. I would, on somebody's first workout, first even week or two worth of workouts, I would do very low intensity. I would err on the side that it's super easy, super light, and wait for them to come back the next day and find out how they felt. And you can slowly increase over time. Because it's really hard to tell during a workout how much DOMS is going to result in the next couple of days. You can minimize eccentric contractions. So at the same time, if you want to maximize adaptation, some people actually maximize eccentric contractions. So they may have somebody help them with the concentric phase and work really hard on the eccentric phase. The more eccentric you add to the workout, the more damage you're going to get. So at the same time, you minimize that eccentric portion, help your client on the eccentric portion so they're not doing as much of it. This is going to help minimize DOMS. And then the other one is you'd only want to do this with somebody who was healthy, somebody who could handle something like this, but you just begin day one with high intensity exhaustive training, emphasize eccentric, and what we see is something called the repeated bout effect, which is interesting. The repeated bout effect is a way that the body rapidly adapts. Okay, so the muscle soreness, obviously, when you do something like this, the muscle soreness is going to be very great for the first few days after the initial workout. But if you come back about a week later and you do the identical workout, you're going to have much less soreness because the body rapidly adapts to something this intense. Okay, rapidly adapts, and so the next time, the next week, you go back, you do the additional workout, the identical workout, then there's much more resistance to the stress of that workout, and we see much less DOMS the second time around. But this is not something you would use with an average person, and it's a little scary because you still keep in mind the rhabdomyolysis, because you don't want to cause that. So again, use with caution. And then lastly, can you speed recovery? Our textbook doesn't talk about this. This is something that shows up in the literature a lot. There's lots of research out there about massage, ice after a workout, heat after a workout, stretching, taking anti-inflammatories, taking antioxidants. Most of these studies show that it provides temporary relief, not a significant speeding of the actual recovery process. It just takes time. And in fact, some people think that anti-inflammatories may actually slow recovery. They're going to give you that immediate relief. It's going to reduce that pain sensation, but an anti-inflammatory may slow the inflammation process, which is going to slow the recovery process. So there really hasn't been anything that has shown to consistently and significantly speed recovery. There is some promise though with protein carbohydrate supplements. The guideline is to take a protein carbohydrate supplement within about an hour of your workout. Okay, the longer you wait, the less beneficial it is. That's because within that hour after exercise, your hormone levels are optimal for repair and synthesis. The body really trying hard to repair and synthesize within that hour. And by taking protein, you are providing amino acids that are part of the repair and synthesis process, and so that's a good time to have them available so that they can be utilized. And the carbohydrate, the reason why you want to take carbohydrate is because carbohydrate results in the secretion of insulin. Okay, and remember that what insulin does is it increases the uptake of carbohydrate, your glucose, fat, and also protein. Okay, so when insulin is secreted, all of these things are taken into our cells and therefore can be used, right? Particularly the protein, because the protein needs to get into the cells in order to repair the cells. So we need to have the amino acids there to go into the cells, and that carbohydrate will cause that insulin release, which will help get those amino acids into the cells. And there is some promise that this does speed the recovery process to a certain extent. Not significant. Almost got through the end without a dog barking.